Anyway, so yeah,
That's super exciting, man.
yeah. This is going to be interesting. I'll keep everyone abreast as I start to buy something. If I get something under contract, we can throw it up and we can analyze why it's happening.
North Carolina, come on and stand up. Shout out to PD Pablo. Cool, man. Well, that's exciting. Obviously, we'll miss you investing here and making the news and all that. So hopefully you still work here a fair bit too.
Okay.
I mean, like, there's the underlying current, though, again, of like, well, why would you go elsewhere? And unpack that for me, because this is something we've danced around a little bit with, like, do you bang your head against the wall in an area that you love and that you maybe have personal connection to and that you're from? And in my case, like, my family is here and all this. Like, I've mentioned multiple times that my buildings are all within walking distance of my actual house. And I like making my neighborhood nicer through these developments. But there's certainly times of frustration dealing with things here locally.
So there's a bit of an X factor. And I think this is what started me hunting in the States. Just, again, it was kind of a potential thing. And, banging my head against the wall here in Halifax. So I have, like we kind of talked about before, there's certain goals that everyone sets up. I've set certain goals that I want to achieve at certain points in my life. And I was struggling to kind of achieve some of those here. I've been fortunate I've been achieving them so far. But even now as I achieve them, I feel, I don't want to say regretful for achieving them, but I feel like there's been a bit of a distaste on some parties. And in general, it's just like, I feel like what I'm doing is wrong. Like, I honestly really do. Like, I don't feel right about what I'm doing at any point, whether it's being a real estate agent and then being successful at that. It doesn't feel right in a lot of ways. And then on now getting into the development and rental market, it's also not giving me a warm and fuzzy feeling. And after spending some time in the States over the last probably 5 years, I found it was a very different sentiment where they really...
Yeah, like they don't villainize success is what you're kind of alluding to.
Exactly. Yeah. They don't villainize the success. They'd like to celebrate success, and it's very like encourage there to be entrepreneurial and start your own thing and chase the American dream, and growth and achieving is a good thing, and it's respected.
I think you're encouraged to be entrepreneurial here as long as you stay a mom and pop operation. So as soon as you try to get bigger than that, then all of a sudden, I don't know, people are like, whoa. Don't get too fancy on us here.
That's kind of, on average. It's a very hard thing. You have to maintain a very strong culture of kind of what people want and expect. I would say even some of the replies that we're receiving to what I said about luxury cars would kind of indicate that people are trying to you don't need to have that. And I'm not saying that you need to have that. I'm just saying that it tends to create a certain type of perception.
Well, even the fact that it has to be a conversation of like, well, how will people look at me if I drive a nicer car?
Exactly. Yeah. That in itself, I think, kind of proves a point. I mean, there is a bit of that everywhere you go. But I just found in general, it wasn't quite as, I guess, it wasn't villainized. And so that really kind of attracted me, just because I'm not necessarily feeling the love on this side of the border. I still want to live in Canada. I still love it here. And I still think I want to do business here. Yeah. But it's just, I find it's more difficult for a lot of those reasons. And that's one thing that I just think is actually it's impeding it, because the general sentiment actually pushes on maybe on the political powers, which ultimately put the rules in place.
It's not just like Twitter fingers online, people being petty. Like, these things have increasingly started to inform policy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we are increasingly socialist as a country, right? And how a person feels about that is obviously individual, but it's changed a lot of, it just limited growth in a lot of ways. And the idea has increasingly become, there's that old adage, Lord Acton, of, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
And oddly, that's been kind of co-opted for this sort of socialist idea of, if money equals power and power corrupts, then power is inherently evil, and by extension, making money is inherently evil. And there's like this kind of little sliding scale, right? Which just isn't true for all kinds of reasons, because that does make sense. People aren't so, all the people in one group aren't the same. All the people in another group aren't the same ever in any group at all. But there is that kind of sentiment going on there that is the undercurrent of a lot of movements at the heart of our political debate right now.
Yeah, 100%. And so again, I don't know. It's not the end of the world. It's just something that I've noticed, and in my desires to achieve certain levels of business, I feel like there's an aspect of that that's going to play into it, and so that's kind of part of the reason that I've explored there. I intend to look at other parts of the world as well, but the best thing with the States for me is obviously proximity and similarity in general, like day-to-day operation versus having on top of having to learn a new market or learning all the new practices. If I have to go to a whole different world where I don't even know the culture.
Yeah, you're talking similar demographics, similar culture, same language, all these things.
Exactly. Yeah. That would be so hard. I'm impressed and envy those guys. We have lots of clients like this that come here and don't have anything, and they learn the culture, learn the language, assimilate, and then bust their butt to grow a business. Like, that is insanely hard. To do it without having to do all those other hurdles is crazy. And so to do that is even more insane. But so that's something that's definitely starting to play into it a little bit. And then obviously there's the other items of like they have privatized banking, which means you can get some really interesting bank loans. They were talking about like 100% kind of stuff. And then again, the market's 10 times bigger.
Right. Yeah. Once you're down there, state to state, bigger cities in the same, like geographically, it's shorter to bounce around between major cities.
Yeah.
Like, we're making hay here in Halifax. If we were to go to like the next big city to make hay, where would we go? Montreal, right? Like, it's a good chunk of distance away.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. And I mean, I think there's a whole episode and conversation about, I mean, it's so funny to feel like you have to defend capitalism and then worry as you're saying it, like, oh my God, I'm defending capitalism. People might like be upset with me. And, there's the saying, capitalism is the worst except for all of the other systems. Yeah. Right? And I mean, I think our neo-capitalist system that we have here in Canada has been amazing, and it's part of the reason we enjoy such a great quality of life. But it is increasingly kind of being villainized as we steer a little bit more socialist, as if people have a very short memory about the dubious history of that political ideological experiment and how it's backfired over the years. And I think there needs to be this kind of dialogue between, if you want to call it conservative, liberal, left, right. They both need each other because they're two very different ways of looking at the world. But this idea that capitalism is inherently bad is just so wrong. It's just a very weird thing to think of, like, okay, if people are this, they're one way. If they're that, they're another way. It just doesn't make sense. I also wondered, like, well, at what point do you become an evil capitalist, right? Because like you start the business and you're like, oh, good for you, man. We're so happy for you. Or then like maybe, or you work a job and you're like, here, and then you join a union. It's like, oh, that's a good socialist thing. You join the union, but then like the union pays you more. So now you're making a little more money. And then you decide to be like head of the union, which is like, okay, that's kind of an organizational structure and climbing a ladder, if you will.
Yeah.
And then, maybe you get headhunted to work in the HR department of a privatized company. Like, at what point along there did you become evil? Because I know I've had this situation myself. Like, I'm a very different person from a fiscal economic standpoint than I was when I was 21. But I know that I'm the same person myself. In fact, I think I'm a better person in terms of like moral, ethical, who I, what mark I want to make in the world. I don't feel that my capitalist endeavors, which have been to be successful and to provide for the people around me, have made me any more inherently evil. But that's not the prevailing sentiment out there.
Biting my tongue on a lot of things here.
I think it's an important conversation.
It is an important conversation.
This is the most we've bitten our tongue in a while here.
I know. Yeah, this is. We're both stumbling here. But I'm going to answer your question. I think how I see it. I think you become evil in the eyes of many once you basically start flaunting it. Honestly, as shallow as that is. Now that doesn't make you evil, in my opinion. I think when it becomes a problem is when you look down upon others based on necessarily their financial, socioeconomic status.
Oh, totally. I mean, being a dick, it's always going to make you evil, right? But like, I'm saying people are, just generally being like, I don't know this person, but I dislike them because
they have money.
They are successful within this capitalist system that's provided all these things, all this device that I want to be hearing yell on the internet. Like, wouldn't have that without the capitalist system, it's far from perfect, but it has increased our quality of life.
I'm gonna use my car as an example. I use this all the time. The car I had
that's not proving the point, Neal.
No, but the car before this, I had a really good. Nobody would really consider me to be an arsehole. And then you tie this new car, and then there's this new sentiment that I've now gone too far, And then this is when I started receiving the comments and people start disliking it, even though I got that for myself
Yeah.
from something that I earned.
Yeah.
And it really had no impact. Like my financial status wasn't any better when I bought that than when I bought the previous vehicle, but it visually looked like it was. And this is now it's an excessive waste of money. Like it made no difference.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think anyone's going to be like, we're not saying, oh my gosh, we need sympathy, and oh, people are being mean to us online and blah blah. Like, we don't care.
No.
The thing that's more interesting is that it becomes this.
What is it that creates this perception? And what?
Well, but also, what are the ramifications of that perception? It's heavily weighted that way in the media, and it's increasingly starting to inform our government policies.
Yeah.
And some of those policies, are not quote unquote good for business. They're not good for business, period. Then this is why people start looking to other areas. But if the underlying current comes from this very simple idea that, or the underlying motivation is like, well, we just don't like people having more money, I think that's, kind of a flawed rationale. I don't think that's the issue. Obviously, inequality is a big issue.
Yeah.
That needs to be addressed. But that's not what people yell about. Right?
And
people yell about just that they hate.
There's also this silent majority voice of a few concept too that plays into it a lot. And I think this is where you don't the voter turnouts are always super low.
Yeah.
And let's say for example, with the rent control thing, only a small percentage of people actually showed up to these events and to rally outside of the buildings and all these different things. But they made their voices heard, and so then it became that the general sentiment was that, and so then they did it. But if you were to poll 100% of people, the actual outcome might be very different.
Well, this is why, look who has won elections, right? If the elections were run on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, the NDP would win in a wash, and they lose badly in most cases. And we elected a conservative government here. So there is an element of that. I guess the part that is a bit more concerning to me is, what is the end game of this? And increasingly, it just creates this big divide. And we're seeing it here firsthand as landlords of how we're being scapegoated and presented in the media.
Yeah.
And which, if someone wants to have a debate over the merits of things like rent control and taxation, if you want to have a informed, educated debate, I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
It's just that's not how it's actually being done. It's rude. It's attacking. It's
using and like we saw yesterday in our meeting, it's using a certain situation to attack a other item. So you were asking a question about a $50 rent increase that's agreed upon by both the tenant and the landlord.
Yeah.
And the immediate response from 2 or 3 of the panelists was, I have tenants that are getting 70% increases. And I understand, but I'm asking a question regarding moderate rent increases.
Yeah.
And they could not comprehend that question due to the fact that all they kept responding back with was, well, I have a tenant who got a 60% rent increase.
Yeah.
I have a tenant who got a 200% rent increase. And understood that is also happening. But then we need to also make efforts to be able to have moderate rent increases with people to be able to avoid having those 60, 100% ones. And yes, there might be, let's say 10% or 20, let's say 40% are having those crazy ones. There's also still a 60% that need to work on the moderate ones.
Yeah. And this, I guess, is kind of where my gripe comes from. Is just these broad strokes of this group needs to always feel this way, and that group needs to always feel this way, and this group over here is bad, and this is what everyone in this group does all the time. And it just is so weird for me as someone who's really individualistic. I just never think that way. And so it's just a weird mindset. I mean, we're kind of running out of time here, but we got this question actually from someone. Again, people sending questions. This is great. This listener said, I've started to really push myself because I want to be successful and build wealth. I've been listening to the podcast and reading, just educating myself. Most recently, I became a landlord for the first time. But lately, some of my friends, one in particular, is seeming to not like where I'm going or trying to go. At what point do you have to leave certain people behind? And I don't really even care about the last part of the question. I mean, you leave people behind if they're bringing you down. And we've talked about surrounding yourself with good people who support you and want to see you succeed.
Yeah.
But it's just that's a case where, I don't know if you've ever felt this way. I'm still the exact same person, but as I do X, Y, Z in my business life and have successes, people just kind of look at you different, and it's
100%. And I think it's people that you've known the longest or come from similar backgrounds. And they sometimes, I think it's a competitive nature. Like it boils down to some competitiveness with people, like where they are either competing to keep up or do better. Additionally, there's also the aspect of like they compare themselves, and so they feel worse about themselves, and so they don't enjoy seeing you succeed. And so it plays. I think there's a few different factors that play into why someone would start to kind of not like what you're doing and maybe not encourage it at some point or kind of passive aggressively push it down. But I think that's very, very common. And I think that's, I don't know if it's a North American culture thing, but keeping up with the Jones, like it's I think that really, really plays into it. And it's not even competitive that they need to beat you or be first. But then again, it's the idea of like now that you're doing that, they feel like they're not doing.
Yeah, but then there's also a lot of things though right now. People saying, well, if you aspire to that, again, like that's bad. If you want to make it as a success in the corporate world, well, that is a corrupt world.
You can't be successful without doing something corrupt.
That's kind of
I hear that so much.
That's the implication, and it just isn't true because that's like saying, well, you can't be a failure without being incredibly a good person, totally ethical, and blah blah blah, right? Like what is this sliding scale here? Yeah. Not everyone who doesn't participate in capitalist ambition is inherently good, just like everyone who does isn't inherently evil.
Yeah,
that's a big loaded topic for perhaps another day to explore. But it just made me think of it, and it's related because you're kind of looking elsewhere for a few different reasons. One, just sort of the welcomeness of the idea and the support of being successful, but also the way that attitude and that shift that we're having here in Canada is starting to inform policy. Like capital gains is bad at 50%. Well, he's talking about moving it to 75%.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's where we seem to be headed here, and it's not, quote unquote, good for business.
When I was broke, I had rich habits.